Rabbie Burns. So Robert Burns, known to the Scots as Rabbie, which is a sort of contraction of Robert. Robbie, pronounced with a Scottish accent, would be Rabbie. Robert Burns is, as I've said in a couple of videos now, the great Scottish poet, the poet of Scotland, forever and ever. Burns is, so actually I wanted to sort of tell this story briefly. So I went to Scotland, summer of 2010, I went to England and Scotland, and I was talking to one of my Scottish friends there, and we were talking about education and poetry, because obviously I'm an English major, so I like talking about that. Very few people here in the US tend to read Robert Burns, partially because he writes in Scots, which is, linguists differ on this. Some people say it's a distinct language, some people say it's a dialect of English. It's definitely got its roots in England, but in English, but it also draws a lot from Scottish Gaelic, and then it's got its own sort of distinctive phrasing that's partway between English and Scottish Gaelic. So partially because, for people who don't know Scots, Burns can be very difficult to read, and partially just because we don't, in the US, tend to really care that much about Scotland. Burns is not often read here, but, I mean, Burns for them is like Burns is like Romeo and Juliet for them. Like, everyone in Scotland reads it in high school. Like, you just don't get out of the education system without reading Burns extensively. He is the sort of symbolic poet of the way that the Scots like to think of themselves as looking at the world, and the way that the English like to think of the Scots as looking at the world. So Burns combines this sort of rustic voice of the Scottish agricultural working class, because he was himself a farmer. He was the son of a farmer. He was apparently a terrible farmer, because he owned like 3 farms that failed. But he was known as the plowman's bard as well, and this was actually one of the things that made him famous during the Romantic period, was because he wrote in the voice of the common people, and he wrote in this very rustic style and stuff like this. And these were things that very much appealed to the Romantics as being more authentic. And so Burns himself was incredibly popular when his first book came out, because of these things. Now, I've asked you guys to read, for this week, 3 of Burns's poems. To a Mouse, Such a Parcel of Rogues in a Nation, and Robert Bruce's March to Bannockburn. And I'm going to start by talking about To a Mouse, and then I'll move on to the other 2 poems, which are of a very different kind. So To a Mouse is probably the most characteristically romantic of these 3 poems. So this is, like the other Romantics, this is inspired by a sort of spontaneous outburst of feeling, or a spontaneous passionate experience, prompted by an encounter with the natural world. So at least according to the story, Burns was plowing his field in one of his farms, and he, with the plow, he sort of crushed a mouse's nest, and the mouse scampers off, and on the spot, Burns composes this poem. That's probably not true. He probably composed it later, and then revised it a couple of times. But, so essentially, what we have here that makes this a fairly romantic poem is this interaction between nature and the human. And we get this, we get Burns sort of making specific mention of this at lines 7 and 8. He says, "I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union." I'm trying to do this in a little bit of a Scottish accent, so we really get that Scots feel. I don't know how good it is or how well it's coming across. But, again, we have this sort of connection here, man's dominion and nature's social union. So we have here Burns sort of directly pointing out this interaction between the human and the natural. And Burns, over the course of this poem, sort of conflates his own self, his own situation with the mouse. So he's talking about fate here. This is the second to last stanza. "But mousie, thou art know thy lane, improving foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes of mice and men gang aft aigly, and lay us not for grief and pain for promised joy." So, I don't know, I'm not great at Scots. I should have practiced more. But, so basically what we're getting in this second to last stanza, this is page 172, by the way, Burns is putting himself in a similar position to this mouse. He says, again, the best laid schemes of mice and men often go awry. So there's this sort of sense, and again, I mean, this was something Burns had experience with, sort of losing house and home, because he had so many failed farms. And we get this sense of loss, failure, defeat. It may be inevitable. But then we turn in the last stanza to Burns's distinction between himself and the mouse. "Still thou art blessed compared with me, the present only toucheth thee." So, Burns says here, you as a mouse, as a sort of natural creature, are only worried about the moment, only worried about the present, whereas I, as a human being, capable of sort of rational thought and so on and so on, am pained by the past, am troubled by things that have happened in the past, and am anxious about the future. So Burns has both melancholy and foreboding, whereas the mouse is a creature of the present. The mouse only lives in the now, and I mean, admittedly, having your home crushed by a plow is a pretty significant problem for living in the moment, but we have, again, this sort of understanding of oneself in contrast with and in connection to nature, which is very characteristic of the Romantics. And then the other two poems that I asked you guys to read, Such a Parcel of Rogues in a Nation, which starts on 179, and Robert Bruce's March to Bannockburn, which starts on 180. These are much more political poems and much more potentially revolutionary poems. So, Such a Parcel of Rogues in a Nation, and Burns loved songs and lyric poetry. A lot of Burns's poems are written as songs, actually. Robert Bruce's March to Bannockburn is a sort of unofficial Scottish anthem, unofficial Scottish national anthem, and it has been set to music innumerable times. Such a Parcel of Rogues in a Nation is also a lyric poem, and again, that's part of sort of Burns's rustic charm, is that he seems to be writing these poems as Scottish folk songs. But Such a Parcel of Rogues in a Nation talks extensively about Scotland's sort of military glory and martial prowess and things like this. But then we get this line, second to last line of every stanza, makes mention of England and um, English economics, and especially stanzas 2 and 3. But English gold has been our bane, and in stanza 3 we get, we're bought and sold for English gold. And so we've got, again, this sort of critique of British economy, or of English economy, as opposed to Scottish military might. So the sort of thrust of this poem is that with heroes like Robert the Bruce and William Wallace from Scotland, there's no way that the English could have conquered the Scots, so they had to buy them. And this is both a critique of the English for buying the Scots, and a critique of the Scots for allowing themselves to be bought and betraying their sort of glorious martial heritage. And then Robert Bruce's March to Bannockburn commemorates a Scottish war for independence around the turn of the 14th century, the early 1300s. So there was a war initially, and the movie Braveheart gives a terribly inaccurate, completely inaccurate representation of this war. But one of the major figures of this war was William Wallace, and the other major figure, the one who ultimately won the war, was Robert the Bruce. And this was a war of independence by the Scots against King Edward, Edward I, and then his son Edward II after Edward I died. So this song, Robert Bruce's March to Bannockburn, also known as Scots Whahay, this is an appeal to Scottish nationalism, Scottish pride, Scotland's military history, and things like this. And this is a sort of revolutionary call for a new independence movement. In a way, this is, so even though this is composed in 1793, in a way this is jumping off from Bonnie Prince Charlie's rebellion in 1745. But we've got some anachronistic references here. We've got some odd references here. And part of what that is again, this sort of romantic fascination with the medieval, with the Gothic, which is another term for the medieval. So, obviously William Wallace referenced, Robert the Bruce referenced from early 14th century. Proud Edward's Power referenced line 7. Again, that would be Edward I, sort of the first king involved in this war for independence in the early 1300s. And but I mean, there's not a King Edward at the time that Burns composes this poem. So in 1793, Britain is ruled by George III. So I mean, that in itself is a sort of anachronistic reference. At line 13, we have "Wha for Scotland's king-in-law," and so I mean, Scotland's king is a sort of odd reference as well. The whole stanza is, "Wha for Scotland's king-in-law, freedom's sword will strongly draw. Free man stand or free man fall, let him follow me." Scotland hasn't had its own monarchy since 1603, when James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England and Scotland. So we've got this series of anachronistic references pushing Scotland back toward a glorious military history that is several hundred years past in this case. And then, again, we've got this revolutionary energy to the poem. So we take the last stanza, for instance. "Lay the proud usurpers low, tyrants fall in every foe, liberties in every blow, let us do our day." This had to be a very dangerous stanza for Burns to put down, because this was the age of revolution and there was so much sort of oppressive counter-revolutionary energy in Britain.